What should you expect from the Carolina Panthers during free agency? I'll tell you right here on the Locked On Panthers.
You are Locked On Panthers, your daily Carolina Panthers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, the part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, as always, Julian Council, talking Carolina Panthers with you every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and yes, of course, Friday, your team every day. That's our motto here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks for watching the show here on YouTube and listening wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Be sure to follow me, Julian Council, over on Twitter and Blue Sky at Julian Council, because on Fridays here on the show throughout the offseason, I'm answering your weekly Friday mailbag questions. All you got to do is either at me or DM me over on Twitter at Julian Council, or simply at me over on Blue Sky at Julian Council to get your questions in for this week's edition of the weekly Friday mailbag right here on the Locked On Panthers. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins, and we have made it. Today is the start of the legal negotiating period in the NFL at noon Eastern time here on Monday. We'll start to see moves come in. The Panthers are expected to be aggressive defensively. Just how aggressive will they be? They're going to add some pieces also to the offense. Very excited to see all the moves being made over the next 2 days. Then on Wednesday will be the beginning of the new league year, the official start to free agency at 4 p.m. Eastern time. Now, today on the show, got Mike Kaye of the Charlotte Observer to help us break down what to expect from the Panthers and what's going to likely happen over the next couple of days during this initial wave of free agency. Also want to understand this too. Talked to Mike on Friday afternoon. This was prior to the Austin Corbett deal being announced on Saturday, prior to the Tommy Trimble deal being announced on Saturday, and anything else that may happen on Sunday. Wanted to talk to Mike before the weekend because obviously I'm not going to have a guest come on the show on Sunday when I typically record shows, and Sunday also is my birthday, and was not trying to sit here and talk about this team, quite honestly, on my birthday. So here we are. Got to talk about all the stuff going on. So conversation about Cade Mays and also about Austin Corbett to start off here. You can skip ahead if you want to, but we're going to talk about Taylor Moton, aka Quanu, the offensive line, how things are going to play out potentially this offseason. Talk about Trey Hendrickson, talk about DK Metcalf, all of that stuff. There's some conversation about Tommy Trimble later on. So you can skip around. I have on YouTube. You should see the timestamps there. Podcasts, you can just simply, fast forward like you probably do throughout the commercial breaks, like you always do, I'm sure. So very easy to do that. Sorry about all that. Just made it easier to kind of put the show out as is, opposed to trying to edit it. I was trying to edit, and I was like, it's just going to make it a little clunky. So, yeah, Mike Kaye of the Charlotte Observer here to break down free agency here on Locked On Panthers right now. All right, back here on Locked On Panthers, as promised, Mike Kaye of the Charlotte Observer, covering your Carolina Panthers. Follow him on Twitter at Mike_E_KAYE. We are starting the legal negotiating period across the NFL today at noon Eastern time. The Carolina Panthers expected to be busy trying to fix that defense and also add offensive pieces throughout the free agency period. Mike, how you doing, man?
I'm here. I'm ready to go. There's no offseason in the NFL, and if this doesn't prove it, I don't know what will.
Yeah, well, I would say the first 3 weeks of February are kind of a drag, as there's not necessarily a ton going on, and then you get to the combine, and then we start get cooking here with free agency, then focusing in on the draft. And I mean, I know you got to write stuff. I had to do this every single day. Like, I sit there in February, it's like, really? Like, can we just get to like the actual piece of things? I'm tired of talking about hypotheticals, even though like we're going to talk about hypotheticals today, as we're going to finally get some answers, some questions that we've had over the last couple of weeks. And we did get one of those answers on Friday, as Panthers have tendered Cade Mays, so for restricted free agency tender, they can pay him about $3 million. And I would expect that he's likely going to stay in Carolina, but other teams can still potentially negotiate. He can negotiate with other teams. I mean, that did not come to any surprise to you, I would assume. And what does that mean for Austin Corbett in the center position moving forward as well?
So I wrote about this in our exclusive newsletter on Monday, which is free, by the way. Check it out on charlotteobserver.com. They're in kind of like an interesting dynamic at center. Cade Mays is really well liked by the staff. He played really well in relief down the stretch last year. But they really like Austin Corbett too. And I think ideally they would like to have them both back. Actually, in fact, I know they'd like to have them both back.
There you go.
What this does with the tender is kind of put the onus on Corbett, right? Corbett's coming off 2 back-to-back season-ending injuries. This bicep tear is less hard to come back from than a knee injury, obviously. Teams don't really overanalyze upper body injuries. So, he's still, in the prime of his career. He started at center, no problem, when they upgraded the guard spots. I think he'd be open to competing. I know he'd like to stay around, but it's a matter of price. And if you can get both guys back for, let's say, $6 million or $7 million, you feel good about that because of the money you've paid at guard and the money in cap space you have wrapped up at tackle. So I think center's a position they can afford to go cheaper on, to go a little bit more short-term on. If Corbett returns, I would expect it to be a 1-year deal, just like I expect Mays to sign this tender whenever he gets the chance, because he is not going to see that money anywhere else.
Right.
The restricted tender has kind of risen to the point where it's kind of a detriment to both the team and the player. He's going to be, you'll see one of maybe 6 to 8 players that get a restricted tender when there were probably about 40 to 50 pending restricted free agents in the league.
Yeah, and I look at this, it would make sense. We cannot forget that Cade Mays is somebody that this staff did not want on the roster anymore. And then once Corbett went down, and then with Ike Ekwonu having that injury to his ankle, they needed to bring him back. And he came in, he played fairly well in those last 8 games, considering the fact that they had moved on from him and who he was up against some of those games, like Dexter Lawrence, like Chris Jones. So it would make sense to give him this tender as, again, he's not going to get much elsewhere. And does he deserve more than that? And with Corbett, he's only played in 8.5 games the last 2 seasons. I can't imagine it's going to be a ton of money that's out there for him on the market, even if it is just a biceps tear. We saw Christensen come back off of that and was able to play every single game and play at a decent level this past year. So that feels like that's something that was always going to get done as far as Mays goes. We'll see whether Corbett happens. Of course, we're doing this on Friday, so it may happen already. But if it has not happened, you're expecting that likely going to be something that happens. That probably clears up the offensive line from there. I think the only other questions would be Ike Ekwonu, 5th-year option. Dan Morgan kind of alluded that they wanted to do it in January, but then seemingly kind of walked it back a week ago, 2 weeks ago at the combine, to where maybe they're going to get an extension done, and that may be better for both the player and the team as far as that goes. And then with Taylor Moton and the cap hit. I'm looking at overthecap.com right now. They got $29.8 million projected salary cap space, which is not exactly what they're going to have, but it's at least what's projected as of this time. And Dan said that they're good either way with the $31.3 million cap hit, whether they sit on it or if they extend him, which opens about $13 million. I mean, what do you think's going to happen there? Because I would think that he's been a good player. Last year's the only time he's ever really had some sort of injuries. Why would they not want to at least open up some space and keep around a guy who's been a constant there at right tackle, opposed to just sitting on it and then being in the case next season where they got to figure out, okay, who's going to play right tackle?
Well, I think there's a little bit of uncertainty about Icky. And so you want to kind of, just based on my read, you want to keep some flexibility there. Let's say they want to move Icky to right tackle next year, right?
Sure.
There's got to be an avenue to move him, right? I also think with Taylor Moton, it's, he's 30. He's never made a Pro Bowl, but he's been extremely consistent. Mm-hmm. They've given him a lot of veteran maintenance days, which to me is telling. He received veteran maintenance days pretty much more than any player on offense. And so maybe it's a long-term trajectory. Maybe they want to go cheaper next year and draft his replacement. I mean, that could be something that they're looking at. Remember, when you're doing roster management, you can't just look at this timeline of this season. You have to look at 2026 and 2027. Sure. And so I do wonder what they project. I mean, it's not hard to read. They're going to sit still. I'm almost positive they will sit still on Taylor Moton.
Okay.
And let him earn the potential extension, which I don't necessarily think is the wrong play here. They shouldn't be splurging in free. We always know that whoever wins in free agency typically loses in life. You know what I mean?
The Tennessee Titans last year, number 1 overall pick this year.
Right, exactly. So I think what they're trying to do is they're not trying to they're keeping the main thing, which is essentially competing long term. They don't want to have one of those years where it's like, yeah, they splurged to make the playoffs. They make the playoffs at 9-7 or 9-8, and then the next year they're dog dudes. You know what I mean? Like, so
Yeah.
like, I think that's kind of where they're looking at. And I think for baseball fans, right? Like if you have a locked in infield and a locked in outfield, it's really hard to upgrade the team. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I think that's kind of how you have to look at it a little bit. Not that I'm saying it's the right answer, but that's, I think, the way they're looking at it.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's totally fair. I mean, I kind of just looked at things and thought maybe, like, is the fact that he has been, I know, you're right. I look back at it. He did have a lot of bad off days this past year throughout the week as far as practice goes, but I mean, only missed a couple of games. He's been the only consistent player really offensively on the offensive line over the last, 5, 6, 7 years. And they maybe could have done it. Like with Brant Tillis, I feel like they're smart enough to where they could have gone to where he's going to start again in 2025 and be set for 2026, but they could have a potential out there maybe next offseason if they needed to. But if you're saying they're going to sit, I trust what you say. And from what Dan Morgan was saying, it sounds like that's what they want to do. Two other guys we're looking at as far as just cap-wise that Carolina could maybe decide to do something there with. Miles Sanders showed us his value, I think, in Week 18 against Atlanta. And there's about $5 million they can save by getting rid of him there. I would think the fact that Jonathan Brooks is going to be out for the majority, if not all, of this upcoming season makes it far more likely that he sticks around in Carolina. I do wonder if it's going to be with that cap number because he owed a roster bonus at the end of the week, or if they're going to rework it. And knowing how the running back market's gone, I know it was a renaissance last year, but he's not those guys. It would probably be in his best interest to rework that deal. Then Shai Tuttle, I think there's value in keeping him on the roster, but not again as a starter. So again, like rework that deal. Like how do you see those two situations potentially playing out here?
Well, let's go with Shai because he's the easier answer. They're gonna have to get him to take a pay cut. Like that's right. He's been terrible. Like honestly, for a starter, I think he can be a decent rotational player. But I mean, like if from a valuation standpoint, he has been one of the biggest bust signings this team has had in a very long time. And I think but I don't know that it's completely his fault. Let me just say that.
Okay.
If we're gonna yikes this,
I mean, damn.
So he signed.
Look, I have not sat here and spoken highly of him at all. So it's just like, damn.
Well, no, but like if you think about it, he played on a defensive line where they didn't have Derek Brown, right?
Sure.
And the year before that, they had no depth. So he's been kind of asked to step up. Like he was signed as a premium role player. He's been asked to be a legitimate like force up there, and that's just not the player that he is.
Right.
I think that Shai can be a pretty good rotational player. I don't think he's a bad player, but I think from the value, I don't necessarily think it's his fault.
They're just asking too much of him.
Right. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
And I'm sure this is going to get, look, I'm sure like the aggregators are going to be like, beat writer calls this guy the biggest bust of. That's not what I'm saying is this was a front office issue. This was a talent issue around him. I think he can be a good rotational player. I'm not advocating to cut him at all. I think you sign him to a pay cut, or you restructure the deal into a pay cut, similar to what they did with Shaq Thompson a couple of years ago, which turned out to actually be a really smart move. Look, Shai's a local guy. He's a really good dude, but I think, he was part of the issue with that run stopping situation, and I think they will upgrade over him.
Very clearly.
He was getting paid a ton of money the last 2 years. I'm just saying, like, that is a fundamental issue for the previous regime. The Panthers took their medicine last year, whatever. He can be a contributor. He just cannot be like a focal point of the defense, which is what he has been the last 2 years outside of his control. And then I guess that wasn't as simple. Miles Sanders, listen, I think Miles Sanders coming back would be a good thing. I can't think of a more motivated dude than a guy who broke out for the first time ever as a Panther in Week 18. just watch the team that wanted to move on from him immediately after a Super Bowl and a Pro Bowl year, then go up and win a Super Bowl with the guy that he has been compared to since he was in college. I mean, he's going to be really motivated. I just don't know, like, again, I think with Shy Tuttle too, the last regime kind of let him down and it's sunk into this past year.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think Miles Sanders again is up there with one of the bigger bust signings of, I mean, I think that's inarguable. I mean, like I that is what it is, but I think Miles Sanders complements Chuba Hubbard in a way that, frankly, I mean, they should look as being advantageous. You know, they're not going to tender, Raheem Blackshear, who I thought got way more buzz as a kick returner than he clearly deserved. I mean, he just
his stats were among like the bottom in the league if you go back and look at last season.
Right. And so, like, I think they're going to look to upgrade that third running back spot. I think they're going to look to add depth to that fourth running back player as well. So I think they can double dip in free agency. If Miles Sanders doesn't return and he balks at a pay cut and just wants a fresh start, which I would totally understand, I would look at Ty Johnson from the Buffalo Bills. He is absolutely perfect as a replacement for Miles Sanders, and one would argue he actually might be a better fit for this offense.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, I would love to see both Shy and Miles back. It makes sense as far as, like, obviously, like, he's a good rotational player. Shy would be. He has plenty of experience as a starter, and like the depth behind defensive tackle, like, the last 2 years has not been good enough. So coming back would make sense. Upgrading above him would make sense. And then just getting Derek Brown would help immensely the run game this past year. And I thought A'Shaun Robinson was a pleasant, not surprised, but I thought he played fairly well considering all the other circumstances, just how poorly everybody else played. And he would only be better this upcoming season. Then with Miles, you don't have Jonathan Brooks. So he's a guy who's already been in the system, whether he's the best fit or not. You saw his value week 18, arguably saw his value even more in week 17 against Tampa when they didn't have any running backs at all.
Right.
So we'll see what they decide to do there as far as those situations go. Well, I do want to talk about defensively, as obviously that's what a lot of people are going to be focused on as far as Panthers having to, I mean, Dan Morgan said it, obviously there's a lot of needs. So we'll talk about those obvious needs in here just a moment on Locked On Panthers. This is a message from sponsor Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was waiting and wondering and worrying if you were ever going to get any money back, and then waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. Now Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find you every deduction possible and file every form, every investment, everything with 100% accuracy, all so you can get the most money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now this is Taxes. Go to turbotax.com right now to get an expert today. All right, back here on Locked On Panthers, Mike Kaye, the Charlotte Observer. Subscribe to your local paper. Also follow him over on Twitter at Mike_E_KAYE. The Panthers defense was awful, Mike. The worst in franchise history, arguably the worst in NFL history, depending on what metric you want to look at. Scoring defense, even though not every single one of those points was on the defense, was the worst. And yeah, they played 17 games and not 16, like the Baltimore Colts, who have now been vindicated after 40 years of embarrassment. A lot's got to be fixed defensively. Getting back Derek Brown obviously helps. Jaycee Horn being able to stay healthy moving forward, that will help. I think at linebacker, they're probably set there starter-wise of Josie Jewell and Trevor Wallace. Please correct me if I am wrong. They may need to add somebody else there, so at least competition-wise. But everywhere else, I mean, there's questions. And at the edge, Clowney got paid a lot. I don't necessarily believe like he necessarily didn't live up completely to the deal, because he did go out there and put up pretty similar numbers outside of just the sack number totals. When you got to look at what he did a year ago in Baltimore compared to what he did in Carolina, and then one of them, had he been healthy, probably would have been someone that maybe got close to the totals he put up there in Minnesota's last year there. either way, like the talent level needs to be upgraded, starting at defensive tackle. I feel like that's where they have to start on the interior defensive line. Getting Derek's back's great, moving Shai Tuttle more of a rotational role in Ashawn Robinson. Like, who are the guys? And like, do you think that that's a place that they're going to try to target? And if so, like, who are the guys that you think would make sense here in Carolina?
Well, defensive line wise, yeah, they're going to do something. I mean, I also think that this defense is going to morph a little. So we'll see how that looks. I think Milton Williams, I've been writing about him for 2 months. It's been popular fodder for national folks for about a week. But Milton Williams
from the Eagles.
Yeah, Milton Williams from the Eagles, Super Bowl champion. He's a guy you can use basically anywhere in the front. You can even stand him up, even though he looks like a traditional 3 technique. You can move that man like a chess piece up front. He can't play inside linebacker, but everything else, he's game. And he's been a rotational pass rusher for most of his career just because the Eagles have always believed in platoons, and that's going back to the Andy Reid era. But I think what's special about him is he can kind of be this Frankie Louvu for the defensive line, and he has the experience of moving around. Oh, and by the way, Vic Fangio's defense is Evero's a descendant of that tree, right? And their defenses are very similar. We saw how successful he was. I think if he's a full-time starter, especially next to a guy like Derek Brown and next to Ashawn Robinson, oh boy. Like, you saw how Ashawn Robinson was able to put up sack numbers, the best in his career. I think Milton Williams is in his mid-20s and ready to rock. If they can't land him, Draymond Jones, who was with Evero in Denver, you know how much he loves his familiar faces. He had his best year of his career in 2022 in that defense. So he's a little bit older. Obviously, he's been paid before, was just recently cut by the Seahawks. So we'll see what happens there. Safety, again, have been talking about this for weeks, but national fodder. Javon Holland from the Dolphins is a guy who's probably going to top the market. I'm under the impression they like him. I don't know if they're going to be willing to pay the price that he might command. The guy that makes the most sense to me is Trevon Moehrig. Like, you want to one of the underlooked issues last year with the run defense was safeties were constantly in the wrong fits. They were kind of all over the place. The secondary did not play the run very well, whether it was against running backs or quarterbacks. Moehrig's a dog, man. Like, you want to talk about like searching for dogs. That dude, I've got a picture of him. There's a picture of him. Like, if you search our database, of him screaming in Tommy Tremble's face when they played the Raiders this past season. Like, he's a dog, and he's a great tackler. Really, really, really good run defender.
Had a lot of issues with tackling for safeties last year. Looking at you, Nick Scott.
Yeah, I believe that they will go hard after those 2 guys and maybe some others, but only probably end up with one, and then they'll double dip in the draft. Inside linebacker,
double dip in the draft where?
At safety.
At safety? Okay, so you think they go after Holland and Moehrig, and then they go draft someone as well. Okay.
Right. Well, so they'll end up with one of them.
They'll get one of those guys. They'll get a veteran safety and then draft one. Okay.
I would not be shocked if they double dipped at defensive line and safety, and
would make sense.
So they know their depth is poor. There.
So are we calling defensive line interior? Or are we talking about edge as well?
Interior. Edge-wise, I think the opportunity is in the trade market. Obviously, Trey Hendrickson is available. The issue with Trey Hendrickson is he is a traditional 4-3 defensive end. He's not like a guy who's going to typically stand up. Mm-hmm. He can play. He's like a wide 9 style defensive end. I don't know that they're going to feel comfortable having a 270-pound outside linebacker. I also don't know if at this point in his career at 30, he's going to want to stand up after all the success that he's had as a traditional 4-3 end. Yeah. So I don't know if there's a logical fit there. I also don't know that they're going to want to pay $30 million and trade a 3rd-round pick.
Which wouldn't make any sense to me, Mike, because like last year, Brian Burns got $30 million. And I was on board with them, keeping him around because that's a guy who came in, 2-time Pro Bowler, team captain, did everything that you asked him to do. And those are the kind of guys that you reward, especially at a premium position. So it's kind of crazy, and we can talk about the DK thing. It's a little crazy to me, even though like I think that would be a nice signing to then pay somebody who hasn't been here, even though if you have a relationship with him, which they would have, $30 million when you wouldn't even the homegrown guy that. And the same kind of case, Trey Hendrickson, who, as you're saying, may not even be a scheme fit, and they can figure it out, I would hope.
Yeah,
but pay him like it's the guy. It's going to be. I would think it'd be more than 30. Hell, you saw Max Crosby get paid 35.5, and I think he is a younger player, so maybe slightly, but still, like that just doesn't make any sense to me. How 1 year after you don't want to pay somebody who you refused to take reportedly 2 first-round picks and a day 2 pick from, and kept them around, like why then you would go back and give up compensation and then give that person the deal that you could have just given the homegrown talent. That just wouldn't make any sense to me at all.
To me, the edge rusher on the trade market that makes the most sense is Harold Landry. So he's got no guaranteed money left on his contract.
Okay.
He's 28. He won't turn 30 until 2027, I believe, like January of 2027. He's still in his prime. If you trade for him, it's probably like a 5th round pick. He's got base salaries of 17.5 in each of the next 2 years. I'm sure he wants some guaranteed money. All you really have to do is guarantee and restructure and pay out bonuses. Like I would just guarantee the first year and pay out a bonus that lowers the second year and he lowers cap number. I don't know if Torrey Dandy's going to do that. That's not really his game, but I mean, if you want, he's from North Carolina. There's a need here. He's a perfect fit for this defense. He's actually a pretty good run defender, which Trey Hendrickson historically is not.
Right.
Or neither was Brian Burns, by the way.
No.
And that was part of the sticking point. So, like, I think if they look at edge in a trade opportunity, like Baron Browning is kind of an interesting free agent, like I guess, but like whatever.
This class is really not that impressive across the board.
No, it's not. And I think fans are getting excited about this, but like 2026, I hate to be the person that's like, listen, the goal this year should be making the playoffs. I'm not letting them off the hook. They should be gunning for the division. They should they should be trying to make that 7th seed, whatever. But 2026 is kind of where the money's going to be, where they can compete at the top. Like everybody's like, oh, they should go after T. Higgins. Well, the Patriots have a need at wide receiver, and they've got like oodles more cap space and a lot more flexibility. One could argue that opposing wide receivers would feel much better about playing with Drake May than they would be with Bryce Young. It's possible, right?
Yeah.
And so they also
have to look at like the cap situation too, because I brought this up on Friday. It's like, okay, like Robert Hunt, they signed into a $100 million deal. His cap hit in 2024 is $6 million. This season's 21. And then in the next 3 seasons, it's 24 each year. So you can go sign those guys to a big deal and do the $6 million cap hit, but eventually like the rent's going to come due. You're going to have to deal with it. And do you want to put yourself in that position like in 2026 where you're saying where you're going to have more money?
Well, and the thing is too, is let's say, I mean, I'm not hoping for this, but let's say that Bryce kind of, regresses to, somewhere in the middle of what he did last year.
Yeah.
And then, you've got to figure out his 5th-year option. If you're not picking up his 5th-year option as a quarterback, you might as well just trade him now, right? Mm-hmm. Like, so I think what's interesting is like you have to prepare for all of these timelines. And I think the Panthers need to be smart there. Now, with the DK thing, so Canales worked with him for 4 years. Brad Izek was his assistant wide receivers coach 3 of Izek's final 4 years there. Like there's a relationship there. But then again, you had a guy who was kind of rough around the edges in Deontay Johnson. And did you learn from that? Oh, and by the way, you're going to have to pay this guy. He's got a $4 million roster bonus due. He's got $18 million in base salary. He's going to want an extension. Allegedly, he wants $30 million. It's been reported that they want a 1st and a 3rd. Now
they ain't getting that.
They're not getting that. You asked for this. You asked for the moon, settle for the stars in this league. And so I don't know if I coined that or I just whatever. But I think the idea is they're shooting for the AJ Brown trade, which was a 1st-round pick and a 3rd-round pick. The difference is AJ was 24. They were negotiating against a second-round pick contract,
Mm-hmm.
and it was happening in the middle of the draft. Like it literally happened on draft day, so it spurned action. It was also, a mid-first round pick and a very late third-round pick. It was I think it was a comp third. That's not going to happen here because you're going to have to pay him. He's on the final year of his deal. He's also 27. And so, like, I don't know. You'd have to feel really comfortable from a culture standpoint. I'm not saying go out and get Boy Scouts. He doesn't have, like, off-the-field issues, but he is, he wants the ball. And
Right.
he would get it here.
For sure.
And he can make everybody better. Like, he's got the perfect blend of size and speed. This was one of the slowest teams in the league last year, and their yards after catch ability was probably, if it wasn't last, it was very close to that. He's a guy who is known for his jump ball efficiency. He is known for his breakaway speed. He bullies corners. Like, he is, like, you and I have talked about this before. I think there's only about 8 to 10 true number one wide receivers in this league because they literally change the game. They can do everything that's dynamic. He is one of those guys. Yeah. He has never had a season with less than 900 receiving yards. He's eclipsed the 10 touchdown mark twice. He's eclipsed 1,000 yards 3 times. Like, he is a dog. And he was playing opposite some pretty good wide receiver talent and still put up those numbers, right? And with an unsure quarterback situation for most of the time. Like, Geno had 1 year where it was like nobody was breathing down his neck, but otherwise, like, Ross and him and all this other stuff is going on. So in closing, I would just say, like, DK makes sense to me. Like, I think he's a better wide receiver than DJ Moore is. Like, I think he's an upgrade over DJ Moore, who they are chasing to replace.
Yeah. And they put themselves in this position. Like, I wouldn't disagree. And I think what's important too is, like, look back at last offseason, because, like, relationships in this league are important. And, like, look at what the relationships that Dan Morgan has. He started in 2010 in Seattle as a scout. Who also started in 2010 in Seattle? The current general manager there, John Snyder, who hired Dan Morgan. And you look at Dan Morgan, the trades that he made last year, the trade with Brian Burns going to the Giants. He knows Joe Shane from their time in Buffalo. The trade that they made on draft net to get into the first round, one slot above where they were to go get Xavier Legette, Brandon B, who he was working for in Buffalo. Hell, you want to look at the trade they made in August for Mike Jackson? Who they make it with? John Snyder. So it just, you have that tie. And also, like, the competition's probably not going to be what they're asking for. Maybe it's easier to make that deal done with a guy that you already know and who's worked for you in the past, you understand well. And then you also bring up Brad and you bring up Dave Canales. So we'll see. Like, I think that's something that they should absolutely be interested in. I look at his receiver core right now. It's not good enough. Thielen's going to be 35. Yes, he's been a nice piece for them. You hope he can stay healthy this season after last year. Legette's it looks like, miss a decent amount of time this offseason with that foot injury. And that's a guy who needs to be out there because he missed a ton of last offseason. So, and I've never felt from day one he was ever going to be that number one type of receiver. He had one good year at South Carolina. I know there's a lot of things that went into what happened during his time in Columbia, but I didn't never like the pick. Think he can be a fine number 2 down the road, but
he's a fine number 2.
I never liked it at the position. Cool, you got into the first round, got a fifth year option. Is he ever going to deserve it? That's my old question. And then Coker was a UDFA, but he's been solid so far. So understand, still was an undrafted free agent for a reason. So they need to upgrade that. Instead of taking a break, let me just ask you this, because we got Jaycee Horn here in Carolina. They're trying to figure out what the situation is going to be there. He can open up, but they have Jaycee Horn. They got to figure out that situation. $9 million he can save by extending him. I mean, we talked about they didn't want to pay Brian Burns, but they did pay Derek Brown. They paid McCaffrey, got rid of him. They paid DJ Moore, got rid of him. It's just a time-honored tradition in Carolina to just get rid of the guys that are good for you and then continue to not win games. But Jaycee Horn is somebody, I'm sorry, it's kind of harsh, but it's true. Jaycee Horn's the guy who showed you last year. They bet on him. I question whether that would make sense. I also saw why they would do it. Okay, any timeline on when this may get done? Because it feels like maybe this is like a post-free agency kind of thing at this point in time.
I mean, deadlines spur action, right? And so I think what's going to happen is they're going to get to the legal tampering period. A corner that's probably going to be notable is going to sign, and that's where they're going to start.
Okay.
he's not going to – I don't think he's going to get Surtain money because he doesn't have a defensive player. He hasn't had that year yet. He had a Pro Bowl. He was awesome. I think he will be very well paid. They view him as a pillar talent. And what I would say is, too, like you talk about that history, Brent Tillis and Dan Morgan, just based on what I know and conversations I've had, look at things completely different than how Rule and Fitterer and
sure.
Bernie and all those guys. So I would say, look, they traded away Brian Burns, but they immediately paid Derek Brown. I think they will pay Jaycee Horn. And if you remember, Derek Brown got paid like right after the legal tampering period. So I think that's something to look forward to.
I think it was on that Friday. I think it was a
right.
Friday when it happened. Yeah. So I think Friday that week.
Right. And what I would say, too, is they need to be smart about homegrown talent, because if they do make a trade for like DK or whoever, they need to show that they're willing to reward people. I think something the Eagles have done really smartly is they've rewarded guys who step up, because it gets guys to want to come there. Maybe they take a discount, but they know if they play well, they'll in turn be rewarded. It happened with A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown got a second massive extension. Zach Bond. Saquon Barkley. Like, if you build a culture where your good work is going to be rewarded, awesome. Like Shaq Thompson, great leader, but it's completely understandable why they've moved on from him, right? Like the injuries, all that stuff. And so I think when we look at this team, they're going to have to be really strategic with how they do this. What I will say is, to go back to DK, and I'll plant the seed for you, the 8th overall pick is a really good opportunity, especially because the guys like Trey Hendrickson and DK Metcalf and those guys, they're all picking in the late teens. This is a draft that is like 5 or 6 great players and then a bunch of good dudes. And if you feel like one of those 6 players is not there at 8 and those guys are still on rosters and you've agreed to something before the draft, Mason Graham's not available. Hey, guess what? Seattle, 8 for 18 and DK. Boom. You still have your own first-round pick. You're not losing that cost control. If anything, it's cheaper. And then maybe you get a wide receiver. Now, I don't know if Seattle's willing to like sit this one out or wait that long, but I think that's an avenue. I would not. You've got to pick in the first and second round this year if you're the pick.
Yes. Yeah. That's the thought. 2 quick ones. Then they got to go. We talk about JC, Mike Jackson, his situation. What do you think plays out there? And then, like, obviously tight end. They've talked about it. It's light. JT Sanders, he showed some promise and had a neck injury. Wasn't really that involved late in the season there. And then Tommy Trimble, like that. Where do you think kind of happens there as far as that second corner opposite of JC and then in that tight end room as they head in free agency?
Mike's going to test the market, I believe, and Tommy's going to test the market. I think Tommy will be back on a 1-year deal. I think Mike Jackson is going to get a long-term deal. Of all their free agents, he's the one guy that I can see getting multiple years from the Panthers. Okay. It's just a matter of what his market's going to be. I don't think he's going to break the bank. He's had one really good year. And so I don't think it's going to be a situation where, like, they're going to, mortgage a lot because they know they've got to pay JC. And if they pay Mike significant money, well, that only just sets a massive floor for the JC negotiations. I also think they'll be open to drafting corner pretty early in this draft as well. So it's not a position I would dismiss whether they sign Mike Jackson or not. This tight end class is old and not very good. Like, John Bates is the only like mid-20s guy who is like, kind of okay, but he's basically a better Ian Thomas. I think this draft is prime for the picking, man. Like, this is a really good tight end draft, and you can get one in the second or third round who could potentially be a starter down the road. I mean, I think they will. If there was a position on offense, I felt really comfortable with saying that they are definitely going to pick. Tight end is that position. I think they will draft a tight end, whether they sign a veteran, fodder player or not. Like, maybe if they can see a good deal in the trade market, like Dallas Goedert's a guy that I've kind of been like, well, maybe that might work. But he's injured a lot. So you've got to feel good about that. And you're going to have to pay him a new deal and he's 30. So like, it's just like,
Yeah.
I mean, Zach Ertz is the best tight end, I think, on the market. And Mike Gesicki are the best tight ends on the market. Gesicki and Ertz do not block. And literally, Dave Canales went out of his way to express how violent you have to be as a blocker to play for him. So,
All right. Tight end, they'll probably draft. And not a great tight end class. Yeah, we talked about it here on the show. Has not really impressed me. A lot of the options out there. And then we'll see. Mike Jackson might get a multi-year deal here in Carolina. But appreciate you, Mike, as always, with all the insight and what's going on with this team. Do a great job. Check him out on Twitter at Mike_E_KAYE. And, of course, subscribe to your local paper, the Charlotte Observer, and get all of Mike and Alex and Scott Fowler and everyone over there at the Observer's team's insight and perspective on your favorite team, the Carolina Panthers. Mike, thank you as always, my friend.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Going to take a quick pause and then come back and wrap up the show. March Madness is here, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 extra bucks to use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories and even who's cutting down the nets. I've got my eye on a few underdogs this year, and FanDuel makes it easy to back them with spreads, totals, and game props. With tournament games happening almost every day, there's always something exciting to bet on. The FanDuel app is simple to use, and when I win, I get paid instantly. No waiting around. So visit FanDuel.com and get in on the hoops action all tournament long. Thanks to Mike Kaye of the Charlotte Observer for joining on today's show again. A lot of stuff that we talked about, a couple of things we talked about happened over the weekend, but appreciate Mike coming on Friday to give me the perspective, give y'all the perspective, and exciting day ahead. So again, going to be live. I guess I haven't said this yet, but going to be live at points of times over the next couple of days like I did last year, breaking down the Panthers free agency. So probably around like 7, 8 o'clock, likely when I'm going to go live throughout the week just to give y'all some updates on what's going on with this team and the moves that they made and what could possibly be ahead. So any sort of reaction, tune in over on YouTube to go check that out. Of course, it's always going to be on your podcast feeds as well. But it's going to wrap up this edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, hosted by yours truly, Julian Council. Again, y'all subscribe, follow the show free on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. And be sure to follow me, Julian Council, over on Twitter and Blue Sky at Julian Council, where I'm going to answer your weekly Friday mailbag questions. Again, coming up here on Friday, so either at me or DM me, get those questions in over on Twitter and at me over on Blue Sky. In the meantime, be safe, be happy, be whole, as always, keep pounding. And I will talk to y'all up probably later tonight on Monday to give you my initial reaction to the Panthers' first moves here on the first day of the legal negotiating period.